It was 1986, and I was in a triathlon in Palm Springs, California, and I was on the biking portion of the race, and I was coming up to this turn, and I was going to negotiate a turn, and there were two cyclists on the corner, and I was locked in on the police officer who was standing on the corner like this. He had his hand on his knee, and he was pointing at me, and he was telling me to make the turn. He was going like this. And I was exerting all of my effort to pass these two bikers, and I kept my eye on him the entire time. And as I made the turn, he had his back to the oncoming traffic. He wasn't looking to see who was coming, so when I made the turn, there was a four-wheel drive vehicle going about 55 miles an hour that hit me from behind. And it was an 83-year-old woman who had somewhat of slow reflexes. And when I landed on the ground, the bumper was still coming towards me, so I grabbed onto the bumper and took a little ride for about 20 yards, and then she stopped short, and then I rolled down the road. Now, as I laid there on my back, I realized that this just wasn't a sprained strain. And I could feel the blood pooling in my thoracic cavity. And so they took me to JFK Hospital in Palm Springs, and I went through a series of tests, X-rays, CAT scans, MRIs. And the next morning I woke up after about 12 hours of tests, and I'll never forget because the whole side of my body was stuck to the sheets, because I was all abrased, you know. So they had to come with a squirt bottle and squirt the sheets and slowly peel them off me. And the doctor came in, he put up the side view of my x-rays, and he said, listen, you have multiple compression fractures of your thoracic spine. You have 6 broken vertebrae. One of the vertebrae is more than 60% collapsed, and the arch that contains the spinal cord broke like a pretzel, so I had pressure on my spinal cord. Now, when you take blocks of vertebrae or columns of vertebrae and you compress them, when you land on your butt, the bone fragments, the volume of the bones compresses, but the volume has to go somewhere. So in my case, it went back on my spinal cord, and T8, T9, T10, T11, T12, and L1 were all broken. Now, the T8 vertebrae was more than 60% collapsed, and that's where the neural arch was broken. And so he came in and he said, listen, you know, the typical surgery for this is a Harrington rod surgery. And what they do with Harrington rod surgeries is they cut off the back parts of your vertebrae, like they saw them off, and then they put in these long stainless steel rods. In my case, they were over 12 inches long, from the base of my neck to the base of my spine. And then after they screw them in to stabilize the fracture and pull the fragments off the cord, then they cut a little piece off your hip, and then they paste it over the top. Now, if I had seen an X-ray of a person or a CAT scan or an MRI of a person with my condition, I probably would have recommended surgery. But this was me. And I couldn't rush off immediately and just agree to having that type of aggressive procedure done on me. So the next day, the chief neurosurgeon from the hospital came in and paid me a visit, and he said, look, you don't really have much choice. You need Harrington rod surgery. The neural arch is broken. You have bone fragments on your cord. You have some neurological compromise. You know, you have a lot of problems going on here, and we need to do something right away. If you don't have the surgery, you probably won't walk again. So I said, well, does anybody not have the surgery? He said, in my 26 years of doing surgery, I've never seen anybody go against this recommendation. So I decided after that it would be a good idea to return back to San Diego, where I lived, And so an ambulance came and took me back to Scripps Hospital. And when I arrived at Scripps Hospital, the medical director of Scripps Hospital was the perfect picture of the physician that your mother would love. He had the salt and pepper hair and the mustache and the lab coat, and he had the stethoscope around his neck. And he just walked in and he locked eyes with me and he said, "We have to get you on the operating table right now." And then he said, "If it was my son, he would be in there." And he was so credible and so confident that I wanted to believe him. But I said, whoa, I'm just not ready to make that decision right away. And of course, he was very convincing and very aggressive, and he said, if you don't make the decision within 2 days, your bones are going to naturally start to heal to the best of their ability. Bone, fragments and strings of calcium are going to begin to interlock, and your bones are going to start mending. And if you decide to have the surgery after that point, we're going to have to cut you open from the front and the back and do a radical surgery, and the mortality rate is pretty high. And he left. Now, I don't know about any of you, but I think that the worst of human suffering has a lot to do with indecision. And I laid there on the bed that day, wrestling with what I knew intellectually in spinal biomechanics and wrestling with what my heart was telling me. I was a 24-year-old kid at the time. I was living a great life in Southern California, and all of a sudden my life came to a stop. And when you're in trouble in your life, when the people around you that are your friends, I had friends that were medical doctors, chiropractors, naturopaths. I had psychotherapists that were my friends, doctors of Oriental medicine. They were all around my bedside. And you're in trouble in your life when someone pats you on the shoulder and they say to you, "We know you're going to make the right decision." Which really translates into, "I am so happy I'm not you." And I could feel their discomfort in the room. And they filed out one at a time. And that night, I wrestled with myself for hours. And I decided that I would get one more opinion from one more surgeon before I made my final decision. And in walks this 6'2", very large man, about 320 pounds. He takes a look at my x-rays and he says, well, listen, we don't have to put 12-inch stainless steel rods in your spine. We can put 8-inch stainless steel rods in your spine and then leave them in for a year and then take them out and then put 6-inch stainless steel rods in your spine. And as he was talking, I was kind of watching him talk, but I kind of faded him out, and I started thinking about spending the rest of my life living on addictive medications and having a handicap. And I thought, well, gosh, I really don't have much to lose here. So I came back and I said, "Hey, Doc, don't you think that would limit motion in my thoracic spine?" And he said, "What? You don't have any motion in your thoracic spine." And I kind of glanced over him and I thought, maybe you don't have any motion in your thoracic spine, but I have a whole lot more motion. I was running a martial arts studio in Pacific Beach, and I had a yoga studio a pretty large yoga studio where we were running classes, and in that moment, something clicked for me. And I knew that wasn't an option. And so I checked out of the hospital that day without the surgery, and I went to some friends' home. And I made a deal with myself that I would do two things. That I believed in the simple concept that the power that made the body heals the body, and it doesn't happen any other way. That there's an intelligence within each and every one of us. Call it the spiritual intelligence, call it chi, call it universal mind, innate intelligence. There is an intelligence that's giving us life, that your heart beats over 2 gallons of blood per minute, over 100 gallons of blood in 1 hour, over 100,000 times in 1 day through 60,000 miles of blood vessels, and your vascular system is 3% of your body weight. You lose 10 trillion cells every second. One single cell goes through the order of 100,000 chemical reactions in 1 second. Now multiply that by the 70 or 50 trillion cells that make up your body. So I realized I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't doing anything. I was laying face down, and I wasn't moving. And I made a deal with myself that if this intelligence was real, I was going to begin to develop a relationship with it, to begin to interact with it, to begin to give it a plan, a template, a design of exactly what I wanted. And if it was a consciousness, and consciousness is awareness, and awareness is paying attention, noticing. So if it's paying attention to me, I'm going to give it a very clear picture. And I'm going to give it a picture that's unpolluted. And I'm going to be completely present with it. Now, you know when you're present with somebody, they usually know, right? If you're present with your children or your spouse or in a relationship, when you're present with someone, it means you're paying attention and they know that you're present. But you know when someone's not present with you, yes? So I said, look, I am going to give a very specific reconstruction of my spine, and I'm going to start vertebrae by vertebrae, and I'm going to rebuild my entire spine. And if I lose my attention, it's not a complete picture. I'm going to stop and start all over again. Now, it's funny when we are in crisis that we spend the majority of our time focusing on what we don't want instead of what we do want. And I was frustrated and impatient and angry and resentful. And I would start out reconstructing my spine, and I'd move to the next vertebrae, and the next thing you know, I'd be thinking about, should I sell my practice or should I sell my home? And then I would start over again, and then I'd start seeing myself in my future in the worst-case scenario. And I was observing the worst outcome instead of the best outcome. And if I was the quantum observer of reality, then I had to become conscious of my unconscious thoughts. And I had to pay attention to my emotional reactions. And I went through 6 weeks of hell. And it took me hours and hours and hours to reconstruct 6 vertebrae. The second decision I made was that I wouldn't let one thought slip by my awareness that I didn't want to experience. And so that was my dark night of the soul. And I was weighing everything I knew intellectually, philosophically, for some type of experience in my life. That if this philosophy was actually true, then I should initiate it and I should have some experience. And so every morning I woke up and I would reconstruct my spine. It would take me between 2.5 and 3 hours to get a very clear image. And I would direct my thoughts and keep practicing over and over again. And right around the 6th week, something amazing happened. I went through the whole mental rehearsal from start to finish. And I got through the entire thing without losing my focus, losing my attention. I was present with the whole thing. And when I got through it, it was like hitting a tennis ball right in the sweet spot. It was like hitting a golf ball just right or cooking a really good meal. Something clicked. And from that moment forward, I knew that I was onto something. Because from that point forward, what took me 2.5, 3 hours to do, I was able to do it in about an hour and a half. And my time kept getting shorter and shorter. I didn't know it at the time, but I was increasing my level of attention. And I was wiring the idea of perfect health into my brain. And now that I was able to do it in an hour or an hour and 10 minutes or 15 minutes, I had all this extra time on my hands. So I would start to think about what it would be like to see a sunset again. You know, I just took it for granted my whole life. And all I wanted to do was just go to the beach and watch the sunset. Or sit up and have lunch with my friends again. Or use the shower. Just do the common things that we all take for granted. And I would reconstruct my spine, and then I didn't know it at the time, but I would begin to select different potentials that existed in the quantum field. And I would intentionally observe that outcome, and then I would emotionally embrace what it would feel like to be in that future experience in the present moment. And what I was doing was I was marrying a clear intention with an elevated emotion, and my body, as the unconscious mind, began to believe it was in that future reality in the present moment. And I was literally signaling new genes in new ways because my body didn't know the difference between the actual experience in my life that created the emotion and the emotion that I fabricated by thought alone to my body. It was in the event. And so, all of a sudden, I started noticing some very significant changes in my body. I started to have much less pain, and it started to be like a volume control. It just got less and less every day. And I started to notice a lot of the neurological symptoms that I was having was changing. And the moment I was able to correlate what I was doing inside of me that was producing some result outside of me, I paid attention to what I did, and I did it again. And I kept doing it. Right around the 10th week after my accident, they told me a few weeks before that they were going to cast me from my chin to my hips in a brace, and that if I was ever able to walk or sit up, I would have to wear this brace because the weight of my body would cause the vertebrae to collapse and I would be paralyzed. And anyway, I woke up at 10 and a half weeks, and I don't know how else to describe this, but I woke up that morning and I knew that was the day I was going to stand up. And I walked back into my life. And at 11, 12 weeks, I was back in my office. I was training again in a very short amount of time. And in that time of those 3 months where I was being initiated into something, I made a deal with myself. And that was, if I was ever able to walk again, I would spend the rest of my life studying these concepts.